YouTube, Kevin here for Superpower Broadcasting. Today is the 15th of April, 2019. In this video, I'm going to be discussing Jimmy Dore's exit from the Young Turks. So Jimmy Dore, arguably the left's Alex Jones, has today left the Young Turks network. The Jimmy Dore show is going to be entirely independent, and he's no longer going to be appearing on TYT programs, such as aggressive quote-unquote progressives. And this is really interesting to watch, because the Young Turks in general tend to agree with Jimmy on most things, but Jimmy goes to such an extreme level where he delves into these conspiracy theories, the stuff rich stuff, the stuff rich stupidity, the WikiLeaks stuff, all this that the mainstream Young Turks hosts tend to not get into in such a conspiratorial manner. Jimmy Dore has a much more anti-American style, much more anti-American attitude than, say, for example, Cenk Uygur, who is a pro-American capitalist, but he happens to be much more of a social democrat. Jimmy Dore, on the other hand, is one of these archetypal Bernie bros, where basically you have it that Bernie Sanders, to him, was somebody who he would vote for, and he would spoil his ballot, or he would write in Bernie, or vote for Trump rather than vote for Hillary Clinton, for example, during the 2016 election. He has been, as David Pakman has discussed, and others have pointed out on YouTube, Jimmy Dore's being arguably the most toxic person at the Young Turks network. It's very apparent just from his attitude, the arguments that he makes. If you've watched him, for example, with Joe Rogan, he lends himself to a lot of far-right conspiracy theories, a lot of the far-right paleo-conservative ideology. He has the same isolationist foreign policy perspective as Tanky Tulsi Gabbard, which is basically summed up as human rights for whites, to hell with everyone else, because if you're not lucky enough to be born in the West, like most white people, well, you're condemned to live in a dictatorship in perpetuity for eternity, because he sees the neoconservatives as the problem. He doesn't see the populists as the problem. He doesn't see the authoritarians as the problem. He sees the neoconservatives and liberal hawks as the problem. Jimmy Dore is a toxic guy. He's a clown of the earth. And on top of everything else, he also happens to be quite just toxic and very, to some extent, antisocial with respect to people that he considers his friends. So I watched his video today where he explained why he was leaving the Young Turks network. And he referred to people such as Cenk Uygur, Anna Kasparian, and Ben Mankiewicz as his friends. But the way that he treated Ben Mankiewicz in particular during the 2016 election, I watched them have debates that went into the level of vitriolic arguments, where Ben Mankiewicz would make some sort of quasi-moderate Democratic argument to justify voting for Hillary Clinton, and Jimmy Dore would right off the bat start calling him insults and use ad hominem attacks and resort to a lot of typical, classic populist vulgarity and whatnot against Ben Mankiewicz. Ben Mankiewicz, I don't agree on too much with him. I like him. I like his style. He generally knows what's up in terms of grammar and whatnot. I always like his analysis on things like that. Small grammatical notes he's usually very good at. I really enjoyed it when Alex Lost My Kids to Own the Libs Jones went on and crashed the Young Turks set at the Republican National Convention in 2016. Alex Lost My Kids to Own the Libs Jones said to Cenk, "Oh, I'm really honored. I'm proud to be here." And Ben Mankiewicz says, "I don't think that's And he didn't get to finish his sentence, but I knew he was going to say, I don't think that's how it works. Because Ben Mankiewicz actually knows the technical meaning of all these words. Things like honor, pride, etc. You can't be proud to be somewhere if you crash sets and trespass on their stage, right? Now, Jimmy Dore, of course, actually wound up spitting on Alex Jones. But they agree on a lot of stuff. They are very similar personalities. They're both very toxic people. They just happen to have some aesthetic and symbolic differences. But at the end of the day, they both buy into these paleoconservative arguments about isolationism, about the globalists. They both, to some extent, peddle anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Alex Jones much more overtly, but Jimmy Dore, I mean, you can check out some of his stuff. He buys into all the false light conspiracy theories about the idea that Assad didn't actually gas his own people. It was the Americans that did it to give a pretext for the U.S. to go in, when at the end of the day, the U.S. didn't even go into Syria. So that's a dumb conspiracy theory. The whole idea with Jimmy Dore, for example, the narrative that he has of Saddam good, Bush bad, the idea that we should have condemned the Iraqi people to live for more decades under Saddam Hussein as opposed to liberate them. He's got just a lot of toxic, a lot of nonsensical, a lot of isolationist views. And on top of everything else, his defense of why he was leaving and quitting was much more respectful than he usually is. He talked, as I said, he talked about people like Ben Mankiewicz as his friends, but he didn't really act that great, from what I saw at least, in terms of his interactions. He was very quick to call people like Ben Mankiewicz and whatnot shills and everything, and use vulgarity in reference to them, shout over them, interrupt them, demean them, to some extent bully them. Not the best friend. Like, I've got friends that I have staunch disagreements with politically, but I don't get into that level of childishness and toxicity when it comes to debating them. That's ridiculous. And so Jimmy Dore leaving the Young Turks ultimately means that the Young Turks, in my view, becomes somewhat of a more reputable network now. Now, I don't agree with them that much when it comes to things like economics or foreign policy, though on social issues I tend to find myself in agreement with them the vast bulk of the time, though in some cases they go overboard in the other direction where they actually lend themselves to the far right in essence by embracing things such as, to some extent they've mitigated things like Sharia law in the past, which of course is far right, but just from an Islamic perspective instead of a Christian perspective. They are very quick to go after absurdities within Christian politics in the United States, but they also tend to apologize or mitigate absurdities in the same theology in Islam. I mean, Christianity and Islam are almost the same religion, and yet they will far more likely conduct apologia and mitigate Islamic double standards, but they'll go and criticize Christian ones. But in any case, they do tend to be on the right side of social issues quite a bit, or the correct side of social issues quite a bit. But I think it's a good thing that Jimmy Dore is leaving. Now, what this is going to mean, of course, is that Jimmy Dore's audience is going to become smaller. It's not going to grow at such a rate, but it's going to become even more intractable and even more toxic and even more of an echo chamber, because at least when he would argue with people and shout over people at TYT, people that watched him and were his fans would still get exposed to the ideas of people like Ben Mankiewicz, or they'd still get exposed to the ideas of people like Anna Kasparian. Whereas now, and mind you, Anna Kasparian is not some moderate liberal person. She's quite far to the left. But Jimmy Dore is so much more radical that she looks like a Republican in some ways compared to Jimmy Dore. And it's pretty interesting to see what's going to happen now. Now, I think that he's going to go in a similar direction as something like Chapel Trap House, where it's just going to become bottom of the barrel, total, I mean, to some extent it already is, but his quality is going to go down even more. And you're going to have just basically an echo chamber of immunity in which the fan base can feel that they know the truth. They know the absolute truth, and everybody else is a shill, and everybody else is delusional, and everybody else is in it on the quote-unquote Russiagate, quote-unquote nothing burger. Even though if it was a nothing burger, why is Manafort in prison for 7.5 years? Why is Carter Page under investigation? Or he was under investigation. Why did Papadopoulos go to jail? Because an Australian ambassador, I believe it was, heard him bragging about the Russian contacts in the Trump campaign. And then he later basically had to concede to it. Why was the Trump campaign flooded with Russian interests? Why was the Trump campaign motivated to remove the party platform that was condemnatory of the Russian Federation over its annexation of Crimea? Why did the Trump organization get all of its funding and loans for golf courses from Russian financial institutions? Why were Russian ones the only ones that would lend to him? There are so many aspects of the Trump campaign, the Trump organization, Trump personally being financially entangled with Russia for over a decade, that to call it a nothing burger is just a clown show. But in Jimmy Dore's case, Jimmy Dore would often peddle the narrative that people such as Stephen Cohen will argue, which is the narrative of USA bad, Russia good. The idea that the U.S. is an imperialist actor, and anything the U.S. does in the world is motivated out of imperial neoliberalism, even though in a way that is an oxymoron, because imperialism is actually taking territory physically, and neoliberalism is have independent countries with free markets and then you trade with them. That's almost the opposite of an empire. The British Empire was imperial. They took places over as colonies. The U.S. trades with places. There are no U.S. colonies. As long as we're not looking at the case of First Nations claims within the United States. But abroad, the United States doesn't have colonies. They're not an empire, whereas Russia did annex Crimea. Russia did annex or has taken over part of eastern Ukraine and part of northern Georgia. So this whole narrative, of course, is predicated on the assumption that, or it's predicated on this sort of foundation that the President of the United States, back at the end of the Cold War, lied to Gorbachev, lied to Yeltsin, and promised that the U.S. wouldn't expand NATO east of Germany, and then NATO expanded east of Germany. The problem with that, of course, is that it places the agency of the actors in respect to the decision, in respect to the morality, on the Kremlin and the White House. The problem with that, of course, is that it wasn't like the U.S. invaded and conquered and forced those countries in Eastern Europe to go into NATO. Estonia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, all these countries basically begged to get into NATO for their own protection. So it wasn't Russia's place to tell them not to. So for the U.S. to promise they weren't going to expand it, okay, but on the moral issue, NATO's in the right because NATO has liberal values and Russia is a fascist state. So it doesn't matter if NATO technically broke a promise to Russia, because if you break a promise to the devil, does that make you bad? Like, I mean, if we're going to get into the whole metaphor around like religion and everything in terms of Abrahamic theology, for the sake of argument here, most people would probably see that as a smart move. Most people would say, well played. That was a smart thing to do. The world is better off. But to people like Stephen Russia good, USA bad Cohen and Jimmy Dore, who's a Putin shill, to these people, they see it and they look at the world in terms of technicalities and, oh, but you guys said that you wouldn't do this 30 years ago, so we're in the right. Putin's actually a victim. And you're like, no, Putin's not a victim of Western liberalism. Putin actually kills a lot of people. The Russian people live in a much worse state because of him. They have a 3-year shorter life expectancy today than they did under communism 30 years ago. And they also make less money now in real terms than they did under communism. And they also retire a year later than they used to. So they're objectively worse off. But Putin has a huge yacht. He's got many mansions. He's got a net worth of about $2 trillion approximately. He's much better off. But somehow he's the victim, not the Russian people. He's the victim. They think of things in terms of the Kremlin versus the USA as bad, when in reality, the Kremlin, there is no bigger enemy of the Russian people than the government of the Russian Federation. They rob, pillage, plunder, torture, abuse, repress their own people way more than the U.S. ever has. I mean, now I am obviously on a pro-U.S. side on this, but it's not like I'm going to say the U.S. hasn't done some bad stuff during the Cold War. The U.S. has done some bad stuff too, right? But it was ultimately in the cause of long-term democracy and peace and capitalism, whereas in Russia, the end game is just more fascism for eternity, basically. You know, they have that Westphalian fetish, that whole claim to sovereignty. They conceive of sovereignty the same way that people conceived of sovereignty in the late 1600s, you know? And Jimmy Dore and Stephen, USA Bad, Russia Good Cohen, they of course have Westphalian fetishes. And so for Jimmy Dore to leave TYT, even though TYT is a pretty Westphalian place, even though they are pretty, generally speaking, anti-intervention, anti-responsibility to protect, anti-human rights abroad, etc. They'll often conduct apologia for dictators. They'll do it at least from the moral standpoint that they'll claim, well, we don't like them, we just think that it wouldn't work to remove them from power. They play into that fallacy, the myth that regime change never works. Even though if that were true, South Korea would be very poor today, and Germany would be miserable, and France would be miserable, and the whole idea that the U.S. has never made a positive difference in the world by intervening. I guess Grenada would be much better off if we let the communists take over there. I guess Chile would be much better off if we let the Soviet Union run it instead. This whole idea, of course, ignores all the cases where interventionism has objectively worked, such as Bosnia, for example, is a great recent example of this. They'll point to flaws with the war in Iraq. I don't think the war in Iraq was waged very well at all. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that it was ultimately not the right decision. I think it was still the moral thing to do. I think that it was still morally right. It's just Bush bundled it because he was a pretty incompetent guy, but he at least had the right intent going in there. The trouble, of course, with people like Jimmy Dore is that they don't make that argument that regime change never works. Stephen Cohen as well. They don't make that argument so much that regime change never works. They actually make the argument that these guys like Putin and Assad are actually, they were wrong. They're victims. So they actually do the full apologia. It's one thing to say Assad's a bad guy, but we shouldn't be there. I would disagree with that and say, no, we have a responsibility to intervene. But it's another thing to say we shouldn't be there and Assad's a great guy. Let's sing praise and dust his portraits and spread pro-Assad memes. Like, that's on the level that we're talking about here. Or the same with Putin, or the same with Kim, or the same with any of these other fascist dictatorships, the same with Hamas, the same with the Palestinian Authority, the same with the Iranian Ayatollah. It goes on and on and on. Basically, any country that opposes the United States, any despot, as long as they're anti-American, these guys will defend them, you know? It's like Tanky Tulsi Gabbard. She never saw a foreign despot, fascist or communist, that she didn't want to defend and praise. So this whole thing is just, I think it's a good move. I think it's great that he's leaving TYT. Now, the way that he packaged it in the video where he explained why he was leaving, he made it sound as if it was entirely his own agency, his own volition, that he was only an employee there for a year and he was an independent contractor for the rest. I'm likely to believe the line about being an independent contractor and that he was only actually an employee for a year, but I don't know. I'm not inclined to take his word for it that this was all his decision. I think it's possible that he got basically pressured to leave TYT because he's been so disrespectful to people, in particular Ben Mankiewicz and Anna Kasparian in the past. And it's one thing to have disagreements and debates. It's another to get into personal ad hominems. It's another to call people idiots or a shill just because they're making a slightly more nuanced argument than you're making. It's another to demonize people. It's another to support Donald Trump. I mean, he supports Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. That's insane. He thinks that, in Jimmy's case, it's even worse than some of these people that deny the Russian collusion. Because in Jimmy Dore's case, you get the sense watching him, just as in Stephen Cohen's case, where they don't actually necessarily deny it. They see it as a good thing. They actually see it as great that the White House is subservient to fascist Russia. Stephen Cohen went on CNN a little while back and got into a debate with Max Boot, I believe it was. And Max Boot pointed out to him saying, well, you're actually taking Putin's word. And Stephen Cohen's like, yeah, I actually agree with Putin on stuff. And it's like, yeah, so they'll admit it. In Stephen Cohen's case, he'll admit it and say, oh yeah, he's a pretty good guy. We got a lot of agreements. He's a victim of Western liberalism. This whole idea out there that the U.S. bad, Russia good, that Jimmy Dore plays into. So I think it's good that he's leaving TYT. I think, I'll say this, get ready for his fans and his sycophants to basically be more toxic than ever. Get ready for, I wouldn't even say Bernie Bro 2.0s, because they might actually switch over to Tanky Tulsi, especially now that Bernie Sanders has released his taxes and it turns out that he's a millionaire. All these eat the rich type people, they're probably going to go for Tanky Tulsi Gabbard. Jimmy Dore seems like he would be way more pro Tanky Tulsi Gabbard. Even though he was super pro Bernie or bust back in the day, I can see him going and shilling for Tanky Tulsi Gabbard pretty soon. And so I think it's ultimately something where when we look at the TYT network now, the TYT network is going to become less toxic to some extent, and the Jimmy Dore show is going to become even more toxic. And I think that it's good that he's leaving TYT. I think that a lot of people won't be exposed to him as easily as he used to be when they would give him all these platforms. Now, he'll still get platformed by people like Joe Rogan, who have all these idiots like Jordan Peterson and whatnot go on their program, Stefan Molyneux, all these misogynists, all these radical anti-feminists, pro-fascist people. And of course he'll bring on Jimmy Dore to defend fascists like Vladimir Putin and Bashar Assad and Kim Jong-un or whoever else. Like, again, Jimmy Dore never saw a foreign despot he didn't love. He disgracefully said of John McCain, and I believe William Kristol as well, that they had never seen wars that they didn't love. And of course, that's bunk, because we know that John McCain and William Kristol both view war as hell, but often the best way to solve a very bad problem. And I'll often argue, war is hell, but so is communism or fascism, and at least war is a temporary thing to liberate people. Whereas if we subscribe to a Westphalian view, that hell becomes permanent for the people that we condemn to live under those regimes. Mainly black and brown people, let's keep it real. It's easy to be for peace if you're leaving it, I should say peace. It's easy to be for peace if you're living at cushy on a beach in Hawaii like Tanky Tulsi. You wouldn't be so much for peace if you were a Syrian civilian getting gassed in the face by Assad. That doesn't seem too peaceful, right? But it's Westphalian sovereignty, it's his business. We are nobody to interfere. That's his business to do what he wants in his own country. Same with Putin, same with Kim Jong-un. Yeah, it's easy to be against the quote-unquote no-good neocons when you're living at cushy on a beach in Hawaii. But guess what? You'd be begging for some neoconservatism if you found out that you and your family were getting disappeared in the middle of the night by Kim Jong-un's goons, or by Bashar Assad's goons, or by Vladimir Putin's goons. And you're going to have to spend 3 generations in some random gulag where you get shot if you pick up a piece of corn without permission. I mean, it's just such a disgrace. And so I'm glad that Jimmy Dore is going. I have just been so repulsed by Jimmy Dore. I think that the fact that his audience is going to be smaller is a great thing. I like that he's not going to get as much exposure. But what I will say about all of this, as I've kind of alluded to, is that he won't get as much exposure by the left now, But you'll probably see him a lot more on right-wing programs like Joe Rogan or, for example, Dave Rubin. I can see Dave Rubin and Jimmy Dore becoming best pals, for example, because they both defend the paleo-conservative slash quote-unquote libertarian way of viewing the world, which is really funny and very much prone to cognitive dissonance, of course, because if you're a libertarian and you're radically anti-big government in America, but you're also radically pro-big government in Syria or North Korea, that's a joke. I mean, some of the most pro-Assad people I've ever met in the years since the Civil War started have been staunch libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, people that are so mistrustful of the government, people that listen to Jordan Peterson or Stefan Molyneux unironically and browse 4chan unironically, but also view big government or whatever as the problem. They often tend to be the most pro-Putin, the most pro-dictator abroad. So there's, as I've talked about before, the isolationist movement is just characterized wholly by cognitive dissonance, double standards. There are some isolationists that are consistent where they say, yeah, Assad's good, I like dictators abroad, and we should have a dictator here. Like, there are some real full-out tankies on the far right and the far left that are isolationists, and those guys are morally consistent because they want tyranny there and here. But the ones who want the double standard, the ones who want human rights for whites and to hell with everyone else, they're even more morally worse because they're not even consistent about it. They have their grotesque double standards. Jimmy Dore is one of them. And so today is ultimately a good thing. I think, if I had to put money on it, I would say that it wasn't so much Jimmy's choice. He's just trying to brand it that way to save face and to look like the boss or whatever for his sycophants. But at the end of the day, I think he kind of got the message, yeah, you can't stay around. You're too toxic, my dude. That's probably the message that he got from the higher-ups at TYT. And if that is the case, I'm glad about it because I think that TYT will become a better place now that he's gone. And they're still not going to be anywhere near perfect, right? But it will ultimately be a more, I would argue, more liberal program at the end of the day, a more liberal network than having this tanky guy on. And there are still other people at TYT that I got issues with, but Jimmy Dore was the number one. Of all the people at TYT, if you told me, who's the one person still at TYT up until the day that I didn't like, I'd say it'd be Jimmy Dore. Before, it used to be kind of a toss-up between, Dave Rubin and Jimmy Dore, but then, of course, Dave Rubin left, and he's gone full defending fascist, homophobic regimes like Bolsonaro's, even though he himself is gay. Just grotesque. That's even worse. I mean, so he's a token as well. He's about as worse a double standards as it gets in that regard, right? The highest degree of cognitive dissonance. He often talks about the marketplace of ideas, yet he refuses to debate people such as David Pakman and Sam Cedar. So his marketplace of ideas is largely a monopoly of right-wing. It's largely a monopolistic market. It's not a free market. He talks about the marketplace of ideas, but what he never tells you is that it's not a free market, it's a monopoly, and it's almost exclusively far-right hacks that he brings on, socially conservative hacks that he brings on. To sing praise and dust the portraits and everything and to have the echo chamber going on. I think it's great that Jimmy Dore is going, and I thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think, what your thoughts are on Jimmy Dore, what you think is going to go in terms of the future here. Do you think that Jimmy Dore is going to become more toxic? Do you think he's going to continue doing the same thing as he's done before? Do you agree with me about that you might find him a lot more on far-right platforms, that you might see him, for example, show up all of a sudden on like Red Ice Today or Dave Rubin, or you might see him on, the Donald or all this sort of stuff. Let me know what you guys think, because I'm genuinely curious. I know that YouTube, a lot of the people on YouTube generally have this view where they see Jimmy Dore as the good guy in all this, and TYT tends to get a lot of downvotes whenever they go after Jimmy Dore. I think it's a vocal minority, of course. And I don't do this channel for popularity. I welcome as much criticism as you guys can offer, basically, you know. I like debate. I like criticism. I like that, you know. We try to have fun here. And I just want to know what you guys think about this. So thanks for watching, YouTube.